Good afternoon, everyone. Just waiting for the attendees to sort of trickle in. As we do that, I'll just do my sort of usual intro piece. Yes, very warm welcome to you all for our next Thomas Westcott webinar, and a very happy Remembrance Day to you. My name is Patrick Tigwell. I have to look at my sheet for that, obviously. And I'm a general practice partner with the firm at their Exeter and Tiverton offices. And as is quite usual now, I'm pleased to be the host for this afternoon's webinar. So obviously we've entered lockdown 2. I've never really cared for sequels much, to be fair, and this one's no exception. Although thinking about it, I did prefer The Empire Strikes Back to Star Wars, and possibly Aliens to Alien, maybe Jaws 2 to Jaws as well. But anyway, hopefully we'll be out on the 2nd of December and life can go on now that we've got a vaccine, woohoo. So what's the plan this time? Well, I sort of say that with due sense of trepidation and dread, because the last webinar we did in October, we'd only just finished and the Chancellor started to speak and changed everything. So hopefully that won't happen this time, and we've got a better idea of what, a bit more visibility about what's going to happen. In a minute, we'll kick off with my North Devon colleague, Head of Tax and actually Head of IT now as well, Mark Tibbett, who will be leading us through the various measures the Chancellor has announced, and announcing also what support there is on offer for sort of businesses, for employers, and if Uncle Boris has mandated your business to close. I would point out that Mark's not going to cover the sort of usual hours calculations. I mean, these could justify a webinar in themselves. If you've got any questions on that and how they're calculated, just contact us, please, afterwards or separately, and we can respond appropriately. I'm also delighted to welcome back John Dunkley. John is Head of Employment Law at Wallens, their regional solicitor firm, and he will be talking to us about the furlough scheme from an employment law perspective, majoring on the agreement to furlough employees and the whole process of if you're thinking of making or have made employees redundant. I think for the future, John, we'll need a colour photo of you for the invite, because whenever I look at that invite, I'm reminded of Spitting Image in the 90s, because I'm not that old, and the John Major puppet. So, yes, but not saying you're anything like John Major. Finally, I'd like to thank Elisa Freeman for her efforts today. She's organised and is organising these webinars from now on. She's also recording it, and we'll email you all, our attendees, a copy of that recording with the email. We've allowed about an hour this time. It may not take that long, but it means there's ample time for questions at the end. On the subject of questions, we have had a few very detailed questions, and we can't really answer those in the call. We're going to kind of put those to the regular partners that deal with those clients, and they can follow it up afterwards. If you'd like to ask a question, please do click on the Q&A button down there. Please post anon if you'd like to remain anonymous. And if you find that the webinar is finished and you still like to ask a question, you still can at the events@thomaswestcott.co.uk web address. So without further ado, I'll hand you over to my learned colleague, Mr. Tibbett, for his canter through of the support available. So Mark, it's over to you.
Thank you, Patrick. As Patrick says, I'm going to look to run through the recent COVID support measures that have been announced and sort of updated to take us through to the end of March, April next year, which is a refresher on some and sort of introducing some new concepts as we go along as well. So starting with grants, one of the first measures that was announced when all the measures were previously announced back in March was around rates related grants for businesses of either 10 or 25,000. Those have all closed However, with this second version of Furlough introduced, we've now got some monthly rates related grants that apply from the 5th of November, and it's down to the local authorities as to how they will be paid out, and we're still waiting on any local authorities to say how they're going to deal with it. But the amounts that you can expect to get if you're a business that has property and have been forced to close, so anything in the sort of leisure hospitality sector, the non-essential retail, then you'll be able to get £1,334 a month for every month you're forced to close where your rates.
Mark, sorry to interrupt. Can you just put your slides on slideshow there, just to make it a little bit sort of bigger for everybody to see?
My apologies. How about that?
Oh, magnifique. Yeah.
Apologies for that. So yeah, for a rateable value less than 15,000, it's the 1,334 a month. Anything between 15,000 and 51,000, you get £2,000 a month, and any rateable value above 51,000 is £3,000 a month. Couple of points around that. I know a number of local authorities are still trying to seek clarification from central government as to whether self-catering accommodation would fall within that. What I'm thinking of particularly there is furnished holiday lets that were eligible for the first round of grants last March, April time, whether they will be able to benefit from these grants. In addition to the amounts that I've put on there as well, there is a separate discretionary grant fund that is being given to each local authority, which, as the name suggests, is down to them to decide how to put it out. The amounts for that, we've got no idea yet as to what each local authority will do, but it's worth just keeping an eye on local authority pages to see what they will and will not put out. Moving on then to the self-employment support and what's changed there. We had already expected it to be extended when we had the job support scheme that was meant to come in. What they have done though is, as well as extending it, they've put it back to the level of support that the first round of the self-employment support was. So for November to January, that 3-month period, you will be able to claim 80% of your earnings up to a maximum of 7,500 for that 3-month period, exactly as it was with the first claim. And the second phase, although there will be something there to cover February to April, they haven't confirmed at what level that will be. Expect to see that coming through probably in January time. The conditions, just to note, for making a claim, claims will be able to be made from the 30th of November. It's been brought forward a little bit earlier than what was originally planned in December. To make a claim, you need to have been eligible for the first 2 phases of the grant, albeit you don't have to have claimed it. And you need to be able to make the statement that you are intending to trade going forward, and you are either actively trading but at a significantly reduced level, or that you were previously trading but have been forced to close or are temporarily closed because of the virus. The other sort of major change is around those businesses that have taken on loans, and I've focused here essentially on the smaller end at the bounce back loans, which are loans up to 50,000. But what I'm saying applies equally to the other loan schemes. So the CBILS loans, which were loans up to £5 million, or the much larger loan schemes. Effectively, the deadline for all of the loans was due to run out at the end of this month. That has now been extended for applications up to the end of the 31st of January next year. And alongside that, the terms of the loans have changed. So originally they were 6-year loans, with the first year essentially repayment free and interest free. That term can now be extended to 10 years if you're going to find it hard to repay. There's a couple of additional measures as well. So not only have you got the first 12 months interest free and repayment free, you can agree a 6-month interest-only repayment period. And during your entire repayment term, whether that's 6 years or 10 years, you can do that up to 3 times if you wish. You can also agree a further 6-month payment holiday. The one caveat to that is you need to have made at least 6 months payments before you can agree a 6-month repayment holiday. And the one positive, although I think most of the applicants that we've dealt with have always claimed the maximum they were entitled to, you are able to top up loans if you haven't claimed the maximum you're entitled to. Still up to the cap of 50,000 for a bounce back loan and 5 million for the CBILS loan, but they can be topped up. And that ability to top up essentially went live yesterday. You can only top up with the original lender, so you'll have to go back to who it was you borrowed from originally, and it has to be for a minimum of £1,000. And what I have seen is that only a few of the original lenders are currently offering the ability to top up with them. It's expected that that number will grow, given that it only went live yesterday. So that's just a very quick run through and recap of some of the other reliefs that are there and measures that are there to support. Turning now to the furlough scheme and the big one that's the main reason for today. 2 points or 3 points very quickly to note. The job support scheme, which as Patrick alluded to, we covered about a week and a half, 2 weeks ago, and then it promptly changed the following afternoon. That effectively has been delayed and will definitely not come in until furlough schemes have entirely run their course. So it could be that it will never come back. And one that was not unsurprising when they announced they would keep furlough going, but does have an impact on some businesses in terms of cash flow going forward. The job retention bonus that would have paid £1,000 per employee that you'd brought back from furlough on continuous employment throughout November, December and January, and would have been paid in February, has been scrapped. They haven't said that it will never come back, but they haven't definitively said that it will come back. Personally, I think it will probably come back in some form, but it'll be more targeted rather than just a blanket £1,000 per employee you bring back. So the job retention scheme, effectively you've got 3 parts to that now. You've got what was part 1 up until sort of the end of July. And then part 2, where it started to allow for part-time furlough and a decreasing amount, which runs up to ran up to the 31st of October. If you still haven't made any of your claims for that period up to the 31st of October, the deadline of the 30th of November still applies. So you need to get any historic claims in by the end of this month, otherwise you will not be able to claim. From the 1st of November, we've now got this part 3 version of the job retention scheme. Claims for which you could start making as of 8 AM this morning. And very helpfully, all the guidance or detailed guidance was released late yesterday afternoon. So not giving people a lot of time if you are looking to try and make a claim as early as possible. But in broad principles, it's essentially a mirror of the scheme as it was in August. So you can claim 80% of an employee's usual pay, which is capped at £2,500, or if you're paying weekly, £576.92 a week. What it doesn't cover is the employer's national insurance or the employer's pension. So that is still a cost to you as an employer if you are paying that due to the level of pay going through. The 80% payment for furlough will remain in place until at least January, and it will be reviewed again in January to see what the level of support will be in February, March and April. And as John will cover in a little bit more detail, you still have to agree the terms of your furlough arrangement with your employee, and that needs to be in writing. So what is the claim period? And we've received a couple of questions beforehand on this. Effectively, there is, as with the schemes for the last few months, there is a minimum claim period of 7 days, which is calendar days. And what it means is that when you submit a claim, it has to be for a period of 7 days. So either say the 1st of November through to the 8th of November, and then the 9th to the 15th and so on. The one exception to that is if the claim period you're looking at, say you're doing weekly, incorporates the first of the month or 30th of the month, it can be a slightly shorter period, and no claim can ever cross months. So if you're paying someone weekly and their weekly pay crosses over the first of the month, you would have to break it down into 2 claims, one for say the first few days in December and one for the first few days in November, rather than doing it as one combined claim. Unlike what they were proposing with the job support scheme, where it'd always be a claim in arrears, we retain the ability, as with the first 2 versions of the furlough scheme, that claims can still be made in advance of you running the payroll. So it is possible to run a claim now, get the money into your bank account before payday. So it's helping with your cash flow there. The one restriction they have put on it is, whereas at the moment you've been having to make a claim no later than the end of the following month, you now only have until the 14th of the following month to make a claim. So any claims for the relating to any date up to the 30th of November has to be made by the 14th of December. And for any claim in December, it would have to be made by the 14th of January and so on. In terms of who can be included, this is where the new version has become a little bit more generous. You can claim for anyone where you've previously made a claim under the first 2 versions of the job retention scheme. But in addition to that, you can also make a claim for anyone that was on your payroll and you'd made an RTI submission for between the 20th of March and the 30th of October. The original job retention scheme essentially had a cut-off date of the 19th of March. So it's bringing in either new employees, or as I'll touch on towards the end, potentially directors who are on annual pay schemes as well. There is no necessity to have claimed for an individual on a previous claim. So whereas under the second part of the job retention scheme for the last few months, to make a claim, you had to have claimed for that individual prior to the end of June. There is no requirement for you to have ever claimed for the individual under the furlough scheme to make a claim for November or future months. It is also possible to retain that flexibility, so you can either fully furlough someone or you can part-time furlough someone. So effectively that furlough period, when they're not working for you, can be any duration you like, but it comes back to agreeing it in writing with the individual what you're looking to do. And as with the first furlough scheme, because they've announced it at the last minute and businesses potentially have gone through redundancy processes and laid people off, that if they'd known this was going to be here, they may not have done. You are allowed to bring people who you've made redundant prior to the 23rd of September back onto your payroll to make furlough claims for them, so long as they were on an RTI submission between the 20th of March and the 23rd of September. In terms of what's needed for a claim, it's very similar to what we've had and been used to. You need to have a UK PAYE scheme, which goes alongside the RTI submission. You have to have a UK bank account for them to pay into. It can include the Isle of Man and the Channel Islands, but it's that UK bank account is the important thing. The employee details, so you need their name and national insurance number. And if you are doing part-time furlough, you will need to have details of the hours worked, usual hours and furlough hours. Very similar to the existing scheme. As Patrick said, I don't propose to go through detailed examples of how you calculate usual hours and usual pay. It's a good hour session just to go through that on its own right. but effectively the calculations are the same as they have been up to the 31st of October, with a couple of exemptions in terms of how you look at specific employees. So if you've got a fixed pay employee, i.e. they're on a fixed salary, if they were on a payroll submission before the 19th of March, then effectively your usual pay is based on whatever their last pay period before the 19th of March was. So generally their February pay dictates what their usual pay is, which then dictates how much, what you can claim the 80% on. For anybody else, so any new employees, say that you've taken on, or where the RTI submission wasn't made before the 19th of March, it was made at some point after, then effectively it becomes the last pay period before the 30th of October, which could be the October pay run, potentially is more likely to be the September pay run. Variable pay, a little bit more complicated, and within variable pay it can include salaried members of staff if they are also paid overtime, and it gives and the overtime is very significant. You can treat them as though they're on variable pay because it gives you a slightly different calculation that could be more beneficial when looking at what the 80% covers. Again, if they're on the payroll before the 19th of March, then you look at, well, what was the higher of their average 1920 pay up to the 19th of March, and compare that to what was the pay in the corresponding pay period in 1920. So if they're monthly paid on hourly, but with hourly pay, then you would look at, well, what were they paid for November 2019 in that scenario? If they're weekly pay, you have to match the exact dates. It's no good just looking, well, we were on week 40 for this month. What was week 40 in 1819? 1920. You actually need to get the exact dates. So breaking everything down into a daily basis. For all others, so where they weren't on the RTI submission before the 19th of March, you look at what was their average pay between the 6th of April, or the date they started employment with you if it was later, and the 1st of November, or whenever they start furlough. So if they start furlough with you on the 1st of November, you run it till then. If you don't decide to put them on furlough until the 1st of December, you work out your average up to essentially the 30th of November. And when you're looking at on average, it's not just a case of looking, well, what days did they work to work it out? You have to count calendar days in the period. So it can give a significantly lower figure than you're expecting.
So Mark, just before we move on, we've had this question in from John Saul. For an employee on a variable hours contract with no pay in December 19 to March 20, who is being furloughed, can any furlough payment be reclaimed? So is that, would you say then that you'd see, well, there's no pay in December 19 to March 20, so that would lower the average for, for the 1920 year. Would that be right?
Yes, but if they weren't working at all for you in that period, so they were on, say, a 0 hours contract, didn't work in those periods, then when you're looking at your actual calendar days for pay, you would only work it up to essentially the last day they were working for you. And if they were paid and on your payroll, therefore in 1920, you're into that, they were on a payroll submission before the 19th of March 20, so you're looking at the higher the average 1920 pay, or the pay in the corresponding pay period.
Yeah.
If, however, which some employers do with their 0 hours contracts, they P45 them at, say, the end of the season in November, and re-employ them again in April, then you're into the all others category, because effectively they weren't your employee to be eligible for a claim. And they went, yeah.
Thanks.
So just a couple of small points. From an admin point of view, it's worth noting if you are, as an employer, making a claim under furlough, Unlike up until now and throughout November, you've been completely anonymous, and the only people that have known you've made a claim would be your employees who you've agreed it with, and HMRC. From the 1st of December, HMRC have said that they will publish the names of all employers claiming under the furlough scheme. And that, from the reading of the guidance, that implies that any claim from the 1st of December onwards, they will publish the name. If you're a company or an LLP, they will also publish your company's house registration number as well. It's part of an anti-fraud measure, essentially, I think, trying to get, if you as an employee suddenly see that your employer is claiming, but you're not aware of anything, you might start reporting to HMRC for them to start undertaking inquiries. And we are seeing that HMRC are raising inquiries into claims already that have been made where they believe errors potentially are there. I know John's going to cover it in a bit more detail, but there is some discussion and hidden within the detail that was announced whether claims can be made where people are serving notice, and we're expecting a little bit more detail on that later. And as I mentioned earlier, directors, some of who are on annual pay schemes, so they're only paid their salary once a year. Generally, those payrolls are only run towards the end of March every year, so to tie in with the end of the tax year. And therefore, they missed out on the first rounds of furlough because they weren't processed in 1920 prior to the 19th of March. Given the extension now under this grant, if directors are still looking to be furloughed and they're on annual pay, then there is scope now to actually get something back. Although it might not be very much if they're on low pay, it is still something better than nothing. And that was it from my side.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Yeah, just one sort of, just to clarify then on one question we've received from Brian Langdon here, just saying about the grants. His question is, what grant would be available in the November lockdown, and how do you go about applying for it? And his retail business is in West Dorset. So obviously you explained about the grants available on lockdown if your business is mandated to close. But I think have I got it right then? What we're saying essentially is that it's obviously going to be up to the local authorities whose treatment of these grants the amounts will be the same, but how they implement it will differ. Is that right?
Yeah, so it's the same as the original grants. Some local authorities tried to be very proactive and said, well, we've got the details to actually make the payments. Well, we know all the rating bands for people's properties. We've got nearly all their details. So if we've got it, we will make the payments out automatically. So if I pick on the two local authorities nearest me, Torridge adopted that approach and they started making payments out automatically. North Devon effectively adopted a claim process. So you had to physically claim the grant before it was paid to you. It will be the same with these grants. What approach the local authorities take will vary across all of them. I haven't seen anything on any other than they're saying that these grants will be there, but they haven't got a claim process or an automatic process in place yet.
Yeah, so I think what we're saying to Brian is, well, just keep looking on, the website of West Dorset.
Yeah, it's keep checking your local authority. It's the easiest way to do it.
Yeah, okay, that's lovely. Thanks then, Mark, and a great run through of what's what's changed and what's available. So, but to sort of have a slant from obviously an employment law perspective, especially around the furlough scheme, John, can I pass over to you for your presentation, please?
Yes, certainly. Thank you very much, Patrick. And thank you, Mark, for everything you've said so far. Colour, yes. Not the John Major lookalike anymore. Okay. Yes, there's a few things I just wanted to raise. I mean, clearly the guidances came out yesterday. There is a lot of detail to it. I'm not going through all of that. Mark's gone through a lot of it in terms of the accountancy side. I'm just going to pick out some of the things which are very relevant to the work that I do on a day-to-day basis, so that you can see my view on the way things are working, and we'll see how it changes over time, because it probably will do. As I mentioned in previous talks, effectively, the government is introducing these schemes by way of policy announcements. And then there is further detail that is added. This is an example of further detail being added to the original policy announcement. It's not based on directly on any legislative provisions. So lawyers are used to advising on the law, advising on policy considerations. Very different issues arise. They will get the force of law at some point. They tend to, HMRC guidance tends to be followed by a Treasury direction, which is effectively the legal position, but it's not the same as interpreting regulations. So all we can do is give you our best advice on how we would interpret the policy now. And unfortunately, sometimes the regulations, when they do come in, if they do come in as a result of this, may be slightly different. Similarly, when we've seen policy announcements before, we'll see a general announcement with more detail being added. Sometimes the detail overrides the general policy announcement. Now, that's not happened so much this time, although it did happen in Furlough 1, let's call it, quite considerably. There's some major changes. In this one, there's not too much. Greater detail is important, but there's not any significant major problems, but there are some things I need to flag up. So let's just go through a few of them. The first one, firstly, you can only apply for the government furlough scheme if you cannot maintain your workforce, because your operations have been affected by coronavirus. Now, a lot of people, anecdotally, that I've heard about, are making claims anyway, without considering how their operations have been affected by the coronavirus. I can see litigation happening on this. I can see the government trying to claw back grants that have been paid out. And it's very important that if you wish to apply for a grant of any kind, that you document how your business has been affected by the coronavirus and why you need the grant. Okay, just do it. It'll take you 2 minutes. Make sure you've got it in writing, even if it's just in an exchange of emails between directors. First tip of today, all right? One of the biggest things I'm asked about at the moment is in relation to furlough agreements. Originally, when the furlough scheme came into effect, most people just furloughed people and there weren't any formal agreements. If employers sent their employees an email saying they'd been furloughed with a couple of terms, that was pretty good. And initially I was advising pressed employees that if they hadn't got anything in writing, they would probably be okay, because generally in employment law, if somebody's employment contract is changed and they don't complain about it, then after a period of time, they are deemed to have acquiesced or accepted the terms. So I wasn't too concerned until the government then changed the rules and suggested that there had to be a written agreement in place, and they put those provisions in place retrospectively. Well, clearly we couldn't go back in time, but since that point, a lot of employers have tried to put in place furlough agreements. They are very different. Some are very detailed, some are effectively almost like a full contract of employment, but with small variations to each of the relevant parts that are varied, i.e. hours and pay as a result of furlough. Some of them are simply you're furloughed, very little else. And then there's a whole range of things in between. You're better off trying to agree a little bit more detail if you can. It doesn't necessarily take a lot of time. You need to cover things like part-time furlough, holiday pay, what happens if people are off sick or have to shield or self-isolate. It's a good idea to get that into the furlough agreement if you can. And as I say, we've got precedent documents, we can implement those quite quickly if need be. Now, rather oddly, the government seems to have changed the wording of what is required for employees. So that in Furlough 1, it was suggested that there had to be a written agreement between employer and employee, which would indicate something in writing from the employee. Rather peculiarly, in the guidance that came out yesterday, it says that the employee does not have to provide a written response. Okay, so you don't have to have something from the employee. Having said that, for an evidential purposes and as a matter of good practice, you should really get something back from the employees. Even if it's a red receipt on an email, you really need to know that they have received at least the document. Agreement really sort of takes it further than that. You should really get the employee to agree to furlough. Now, that has proved difficult from time to time. Most employees just think, well, great, I'm getting 80% and I'm not getting sacked. Brilliant, I'll accept. Some people say, well, why am I only getting 80%? I should be working. I need 100%. I've got a mortgage to pay and I'm not agreeing to furlough. It's not happening that often, but when it does happen, then it poses a challenge for the employer. Because what do? Do you accept what the employee is saying and say, okay, fair enough, we won't put you on furlough, we'll keep you working? You may or may not be able to do that. Or do you terminate their employment? Right? So the things that you can do, but it's always difficult when an employee refuses to go or sign a furlough agreement. So I'm just flagging it up as a problem. But most of the time, people will simply agree. Now, it's really, really important, that's more important than really important, for you to make sure that your employees do not work whilst they are furloughed. Absolutely fundamental at all right? The only exception to that is in relation to directors who are entitled to carry out statutory functions only. And that's really, really minor points that they can do. But employees cannot work for the business whilst they're furloughed. So if they're furloughed full-time, they can't work for them at all. If they're furloughed part-time, they cannot work during the period of part-time furlough. All right, so I have seen a lot of businesses that have got employees to do things whilst they are furloughed. And some of them have been reported to HMRC and various other bodies by the very employees that they had asked to work. It is happening all the time. And I can tell you a number of reasons why. Well, firstly, you don't want to have to work if you're an employee and you're furloughed. You're getting 80%, you'd get 100% if you were working, so why should you? So it's just not fair. But the other thing is that if you are an employee and you complain to your employer that they have acted illegally by asking you to work whilst you should have been furloughed, and you then dismiss them, you're going to have a claim almost certainly. I've seen a number of these. I'm dealing with one today, in fact, and I'm dealing with about 3 in total at the moment, where employees have complained about being asked to work whilst on furlough. The employer has just said, just get on with it. And they have complained. The employer has then dismissed them, and they've been able to claim that they've been dismissed as a result of making what we call a protected disclosure, a disclosure of illegal activity effectively to the employer. So do not be tempted, no matter how small the task, to ask employees to do anything when they are on furlough. I've seen some very minor requests, things that really are completely reasonable and fair that you would have asked of anybody, but be so careful on this particular point because it is directly resulting in litigation. Now, according to the government, because they've only just introduced the rules on written agreements in relation to furlough 2, you can make retrospective claims back to the 1st of November, but only if you have a written agreement with affected employees in place on or before Friday the 13th of November, i.e. this Friday. All right, so not only were you only notified of the rules yesterday, you've also got to act by Friday to try and implement that agreement. So make sure you do. At the very least, just have an exchange of emails with an employee, but you're better off having a proper furlough agreement, let's call it. Okay. All right, that's written agreements. I could talk to you all day about that, but I won't. So let's move on to something else. Next issue is in relation to holiday pay. Now, holiday pay accrues all the time whilst an employee is working, and holiday pay, many employers will want employees to take holiday pay during furlough because otherwise the alternative is that it accrues and all has to be taken at the end of furlough. That might mean that the employee runs out of time and has to carry their holiday over to another holiday year. But either way, you're going to have no employees if they're all taking holiday at the end of the furlough period. So the general answer is that yes, you can force employees to take holiday during the furlough period. And you probably should take advantage of that if you are going to be struggling for cash or you are going to have lots of people off at the end of the furlough scheme. Now, you can't do this if your terms and conditions, your contracts and policies prevent you from doing it. So you do need to double check those. But assuming you can do this, you need to give employees twice the amount of notice when compared to the amount of holiday taken. So if you want them to take a week of their accrued holiday during the furlough period, you've got to give them 2 weeks notice to take that holiday. Of course, when people are on holiday, they're entitled to be paid 100% of their wages, not just the 80% under the furlough scheme. All right, so that's just holiday pay in a nutshell. There are some complications with it, but that's effectively an overview. Next thing I want to move on to is what can employees do whilst they are furloughed? Now, very little is the answer to that. They can go and work for somebody else, provided their terms and conditions and their contracts allows them to do that, and they can volunteer for somebody else, so that's fine. They just can't work for you, right? And you probably ought to put something in the furlough agreement to say whether you consent to them working for somebody else or not. And if you do consent, who you might consent that they work with, presumably not one of your competitors. In terms of other activities, there's very limited amount of training that employees can undertake whilst they're on furlough, but only general training, not things that would directly benefit the business. That's going to be arguable, I'm afraid. I can't give you any more guidance on it at this stage, but that's the rule. And also, employees can carry out union activities if you have a unionized workforce, provided it doesn't benefit the business. All right, so those are really, that's an overview of the exceptions. Right, let's move on to redundancies. Nobody likes to talk about redundancies, but a lot of people are making redundancies at the moment, even if they are making a small number to protect the existing workforce. All right. You have to, there are rules on making redundancies. You can't just make them. You've got to give notice. There's got to be a prior consultation period. If you're making more than 20 redundancies in any 90-day period at any one establishment, you've got to go through at least a 30-day consultation period. So these general provisions. Now, I'm pleased to say that at the moment, if an employee is serving their statutory notice period, you as an employer can continue to claim furlough pay during that period. All right. Now, the employee will be entitled to be paid at 100% of their pay for their notice period, and the employer will be able to claim the furlough amount, the 80% effectively. Right. You still have to pay the redundancy payment. You have to pay all of that. I'm afraid you can't get out of that one. All right. Now, the bit that nobody was really expecting in relation to the latest guidance is that the government is likely to review this for claim periods starting on or after the 1st of December 2020. And the further guidance isn't going to be published until late November, whenever that is. So at the last minute again. Now that does place employers in a slightly difficult position. If you were going to make employees redundant, but out of the kindness of your heart are keeping them on so that they can claim some furlough pay, you're putting yourself at extra risk. I'm not saying don't do it. It's a nice, fair, kind thing to do. And you may need them at the end of that period as well. But if you're definitely not going to need them, then you really need to consider whether you need to terminate their employment on or before the 1st of December. All right. If you're going to do that, you need to take some advice on it. It's a little bit tricky and we don't know what the guidance will be. And indeed, it may not even come in or it might change by then. But that is one big trigger point that employers need to be aware of. I don't want you to be trapped by that should you have kept people on out of the kindness of your heart. All right. That's largely everything I want to say about the scheme. I just make two very small points in that if you are in a situation where your business might go into administration, even if you're going to purchase the assets yourself, or if you're in a situation where you've purchased another business and employees transfer under TUPE, the general rule is that employees can be furloughed. All right, there are some technical reasons why they might not be able to, but generally speaking, they could be. And again, if you're in that situation, you'll be taking advice anyway, so I won't talk about it anymore at the moment. But that's everything I think you need to know from a legal perspective in around about 20 minutes from an employment lawyer following the guidance that came out yesterday. So I hope they found that useful, and I'll pass you back to Patrick, and I'm happy to ask any questions you've got.
Yeah, thank you, John. Yeah, always good to have a finely tuned legal mind on these things. But we couldn't get one of those, so we've got you.
I knew you were going to say that.
And here are we. A couple of questions we have had earlier. What's the situation with a member of staff who has received official notification of being a vulnerable person and advised that if they can't work from home, they shouldn't attend work? Can they be furloughed still?
Yes, absolutely. That's one of the key tenets of the scheme. You can furlough them. I can't say any more than that. Yes is the answer.
Yes.
You normally get such a clear answer from a lawyer. I'm not saying that the guidance won't change, but yes, that is the case at the moment.
And obviously, we've been talking about the sort of the redundancy situation. And if an employee is being made redundant, and the employee wants to kind of to say to the employer, look, can you re-employ me just for the purposes of the furlough? Does that employee have any rights to sort of, that's the basis of the question, can they kind of force the employer to re-employ them for the furlough period? Or if they don't, would the employer be subject to potential legal action or legal challenge?
Yeah, okay. The general answer is the employer wouldn't be subject to legal challenge. I say the general answer because if I was instructed otherwise, there are some technical arguments that you could employ. So, for instance, there is a duty to act fairly, reasonably and consistently with employees in any contract of employment. It's an implied term, so even if it's not in writing. So if you had allowed some employees to come back and not others, for instance, you could theoretically employ a legal argument that would incur you in liability. But the general rule is that as long as you have terminated their employment properly and correctly and not unfairly in legal parlance, then there should not be any liability under any normal circumstances. And I wouldn't want people to be concerned about that.
Yeah.
All right. They're mainly technical, theoretical risks, but I reserve the right to, of course, argue them should I need to in the future, but they're not strong arguments from an employment law perspective.
Okay, thanks for that, John. And while you're on a bit of a roll here, a couple just more ones for yourself. Can you furlough employees who've been advised to self-isolate? So I guess if you've got to do your 2 weeks or 1 week, whatever it is now, I suppose it doesn't say if that person could work from home or not, but...
Yeah, okay. Yeah. It's a good question because it's suitably ambiguous and covers both eventualities. So yes, if they can work from home, you can require them to work from home. If you want to furlough them, you can furlough them. Now, again, that comes back to the whole issue of fairness that we were talking about. And I probably should have mentioned it earlier, but if you wish to furlough staff, you should really fairly select the ones that are going to be furloughed. All right. If it is fair from the business perspective and also taking into account any disability discrimination type issues for you to furlough staff that are shielding or self-isolating, then you can furlough them. Absolutely. You would need to theoretically get their agreement and get a furlough agreement with them. But yes, there's no reason in principle why you can't agree with them that they should be furloughed. And a lot of people would agree with that because the alternatives are often worse, i.e. you might be forcing a redundancy situation.
Yeah, and there's somebody anonymous, just a couple of questions from him or her. Can you place a long-term sick employee on furlough? And what's the position with furloughing employees who are sick or going on maternity leave? So it's sort of similar.
Yes, okay. So three separate issues. So one, the furlough scheme is not designed for people that are on long-term sickness absence. All right. Now, what that means in terms of actual law is questionable. All right. But the guidance is quite clear that it's not designed or intended for employees that are on very long-term sickness absence. Employees that are on short-term sickness absence, slightly different rules apply. So if they were furloughed anyway, and then they go off and then they tell you they're sick, you just can keep them on furlough. There's no requirement for you to do anything different there. If they're working and they are then off sick, you would normally just pay them either statutory sick pay if they're entitled to it, if it's for more than 3 days, or contractual sick pay. And then we've got contractual issues coming into play. So you can't really furlough people on 80% if they're contractually entitled to 100% under the sick pay scheme. So that becomes a little bit more complicated then, and we would have to consider the circumstances. But at least in theory, you can furlough people that are off sick. It's just normally, if it's for a short period of time, you just pay them sick pay.
Okay. And just one more for you, John, before a couple.
Sorry, I didn't answer that one, did I? Sorry, there was a bit on maternity leave, wasn't there?
Yeah, maternity, yes.
Yeah.
Maternity leave.
Normally, if employees are on maternity leave, they would get maternity pay and either statutory or contractual, and you wouldn't normally furlough employees unless they were going to get more money for some reason, and you'd have to do that by agreement. So that's a bit of a technical one there, I'm afraid.
Okay.
That's a very much a summary answer, I'm afraid. I'm not going to be bound by that.
No, that's fine.
Sorry, Patrick. Sorry, you had another question.
Yeah, talking the agreements, a very good question, really. Does from Jenny, does the original furlough agreement still stand from March? And so if you organise something then, would it just simply roll over from October now to November and so on, or does it a fresh agreement required?
It's a very good question, because there's a bit of academic debate about this, but I won't bore you with the detail. It effectively depends upon the wording of the agreement. So if the agreement is worded as continuing in perpetuity, then you don't need a new agreement. If it only relates to the original furlough scheme, and this scheme is different and you require to change it, you may well need another agreement. Out of safety's sake, you really need another agreement, even if it's largely similar to the one you signed before. Probably out of an abundance of caution, just get another one signed up, because otherwise you're potentially at risk should you claim through the furlough scheme and then it be recouped from you should you have not followed some technical requirement of the rule. So you're better off having a new one, really, if you can, even if it's the same as the original one.
Yeah, I think that's, thanks, John. That's very good advice. What I would say is, obviously, we're getting a few of these questions. Most of them seem to be obviously for John. You're very welcome to keep sending the questions in, and what we can do is just forward them to John after the webinar, and then he can reply to you direct. I think generally the moral of the story is do contact an employment lawyer to sort of have these things answered, really. You don't want to get it wrong. But a couple for Mark then, please. Mark, can you furlough for anyone on enhanced or company maternity pay? What would you
Sort of linked to what John was saying there.
Yeah.
If they're on maternity pay, effectively they can't be furloughed because you'd have to end the maternity period, which generally is you have to give 8 weeks notice, I think it is. Correct me if I'm wrong, John.
No, that's correct. Yeah.
So it depends on whether it's an extended maternity period or whether it's still within the normal maternity period.
Yeah, okay. And what's the last date? Again, when is the last date you can furlough an employee on the new scheme?
Effectively, the scheme is there until the end of March. So you've got until then to furlough them at any point. What I would say is that we don't know definitively what that furlough amount will look like past January.
Yeah. So basically, get on and do it now.
Yeah, effectively, unlike the first part of the scheme where you had to be on furlough for a minimum 3-week period, so there was a definitive cut-off date. There isn't a strict end date, because you could just furlough them for the last day the scheme's there if you really wanted to.
Okay, that's great. Just one other question I'd answer myself. We had it from Hilary on the registration. Are the speakers aware of any impact on mortgage eligibility for people who've been furloughed? I took the opportunity to ask a mortgage broker contact of mine who said that generally lenders will take into account furloughed, sort of income, but obviously they are looking at it on a case-by-case basis. So, obviously he then caveated what he'd said, they are mindful of that. But generally, it should be included on sort of income and affordability calculations. So hopefully that's a good enough answer for you, Hilary. I think actually just one more sneaked in. Oh, she's just said thank you. So, well, thank you. I think that will bring us to the end of this week's webinar. The flow of questions has sort of has stopped really now. But if you, as I say, if you want to ask a question, please still do so. events@thomaswestcott.co.uk. We will attend to every question. I'd just remind you that we have another webinar actually tomorrow, hosted by yours truly again, and on the reverse charge sort of systems coming in next year, theoretically coming in. So if you're in the construction industry or you're affected by that, do sort of tune in. A couple of my colleagues from our Plymouth office who are experts on this will be giving you the technical information you need. I'd like to finish off by thanking our speakers today, Mark and John. That's John Dunkley, not John Major, obviously. And I'd also like to thank you, our attendees. Thank you for watching, and hopefully it's been sort of informative for you. And have a great rest of the week, and enjoy lockdown too. And as ever, embrace my inner Ron Burgundy. Stay safe, Devon and Somerset. Thank you for now. Cheers.